Hi everybody, welcome to my homestead and welcome to my channel. In this video, we are going to be looking at the terms comes again, hasten, and hastening, and how many times these terms show up in general conferences between 1942 to present. So if you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe, like this video if you end up liking it. Make sure to leave your thoughts and opinions in the comments below, and also make sure to share this with anyone that is interested in the second coming. This might be helpful to them. So again, if you're new to this, I used the Scripture Citation Index, scriptures.byu.edu. You can go down here to search at the bottom right, and then you can search phrases and words that show up in General Conference talks between 1942 and present. Okay, so I went through these, and like I said before in the previous video, I made sure that all these are in the context of the second coming. So if these words were brought up and it didn't relate to the second coming, then I didn't count it. Okay, so I want to also point out the difference between hasten and hastening. Hastening is a gerund, meaning when you have an ing at the end. In Latin, that expresses generalized or uncompleted action. So in other words, something that is like that hasn't happened or it is happening, right? Hastening. It's in the act of happening. Whereas hasten, you can use it as like, let me think, like he, sorry, he will he can hasten, like he will hasten or he can hasten. Let's see, what are some other will, can, it, no. Whereas hastening, he is hastening, he was hastening, and I can tell you right now that he was is not that doesn't show up in these conference talks. It's usually he is hastening or some kind of, form of that. Okay, so anyway, let's move on. And then comes again. So like when he comes again. Yeah, when he comes again. Okay, so starting off, there is just absolutely nothing for hastening. There is for hasten, which makes sense because this is like way in the past, back in the 40s during World War II. So the Lord will hasten his work. He can hasten his work. He may hasten his work. Okay. Comes again. It's a little bit more sparse. Once in 43, and then 42, almost 10 years later. Okay, so let's go up. So there's quite a bit for hasten. Not so much for hastening, but now in the 60s, starting from 60 to 67, we have a few. 1, 2, 4, 5, 6. 6 hastenings, and then there's also kind of a lot of hasten right here. Okay, let's keep going. And then still not a whole lot for comes again. Okay, now we're in the 70s. And like I've pointed out before in previous videos, it's almost the case with every single second coming term that there are a lot of second coming terms that show up in the 70s, and then kind of into the early 80s as well, and then sometimes into the late 60s. But this is like the center point for what I call like the 70s cluster. Okay, so we have a lot of hasten. We do have one hastening in 1977, so that's after this cluster that was back in the 60s. Okay, and then we have a lot of comes again as well. A lot more compared to how many are there before that? 1, 2, 3, 4. Only 4 times before 1969. From 1969 to 1942 is only brought up 4 times, comes again. But then all of a sudden there's this big old cluster right here. Okay, and then we have kind of like a little cluster in the early 80s. Hasten continues to be used, and it's pretty solid here. Okay, now comes again. There's a big gap between um, 83 and 91, or I guess you could say 82, between 82 and 92. So we have one in 92 for comes again, another one in 97 for comes again. We have a few more hastenings over here in the third column, but they're kind of spread out a little bit. They're not really clustered so much. Okay, now let's go up. Now look at all this white right here, all this white space between, I guess you could say, 2011 and about 95. So from 1995 to 2011, there's not a lot of any of these terms at all. Now there is a spike in 1999 of hasten, and that makes sense, I think, because these are the Hinckley years. This is when he's wanting to do the 100 small temples, or get to 100 temples, uh, where he introduces, again, it wasn't him that came up with the idea of small temples, as we learned about in that talk from Elder Bednar, but he's the one that wanted to get to over 100, and he did. And that certainly was a hastening of the work. Although they didn't use the word hastening, they used the word hasten. And then in the years that followed, a few more times. Okay, 2002, 4, 5, and 6. Okay, now let's move on up. Okay, now this is interesting because in 2013, we have a cluster between all three of these terms. And more than that, you have our first, I think this is our first yellows, which mean 5 or 6. Okay, 3 and 4 are green, 1 and 2 are blue. So let me just double check that. Up until this point, all there is just blue and green for hasten and hastening. But once we get to 2013 and 2014, the Monson years, all of a sudden there's this pretty big uptick in hastening. Okay, so now we're really talking about it happening now. Remember that a gerund, that's something that's incomplete or like in the process of happening. Okay, so now, okay, up until this point, okay, 2013, hastening has only been said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, only 10 times since 1942. Only 10 times since 1942, and then all of a sudden we have 5 in just 1 year. You got to think of it in those terms, because that kind of shows you the reality of it. This is highly unusual. You know, you would call this an anomaly, right? Why is this coming up all of a sudden in just 1 year, when before this point we've only ever seen it 10 times spread out, with the exception of 1964, where it was said 2 times. That's the only year before before that it was mentioned more than once in a year. Okay, and then over here with hasten, we have a 6. So we've got a cluster going on here. Okay, now let's keep moving up. Okay, now we're to modern day, and now we can see a definite cluster right here. We have a couple greens, some greens over here, green, green. Okay, hastening all of a sudden is like all the talk. Hastening has come to life, right? So we got, let's see, 5. No, I'm not going to count it all up, but we got a bunch right here, a big cluster. You could put this all together as one cluster, and then it corresponds with hasten. You see this? They both start in 2013. So from 2013 on, you have the hastening cluster. And then it comes again, there's a big uptick in that too. Maybe not so dramatic as hasten and hastening, but it's like pretty solid. So what does this look like when we zoom out? We'll zoom out to 50%. So Hasten is pretty solid throughout the years, even all the way back to 1942. And remember, you can use hasten in phrases like he will hasten, he can hasten. However, hastening is more like he is hastening, right? So we have all this like empty space down here, just a few times right here with hastening, and then a big, huge gap in the 90s and early 2000s. And then all of the sudden, it just comes to life in 2013, right? And then you could say kind of the same thing with hastening because before 2014, the last time that you see it more than twice in 1 year is 1999. So that's in when you look at it that way, that's another big gap. And then look at this gap right here for comes again. Sorry, I know this is probably small on your screen. Um, there's not much I can really do about that, but there's a big gap for comes again between 2010 all the way down to 1983. During that gap, comes again only comes up 4 times. So huge gap, gap, big gap right here. This is a quiet time. For these phrases, this is a quiet time. And then you see the big cluster down here in the 70s. But what's noticeably absent in the 70s is hastening. It comes up once, and then in the 60s, there's a cluster of hastening, but not in the 70s when all this is going on. Okay, so there you go. This is what these three phrases look like over the years from 1942 until present. There is a noticeable uptick in the last several years. They are talking more and more about the second coming, and it's happening like all of a sudden. It's not just like tapering in, and it's not just gradual. It's just like boom, just all of a sudden, big old block, cluster of terms. And it's like this across pretty much all terms. You know, at the end of this series, I'm going to look at the big picture, show you everything all together, and you'll see that this is the pattern. Big cluster in the 70s across all terms, not just these three, but other ones, and then um, clustering starting usually around 2016 or so, but just kind of generally, this is probably the earliest, just like right here, 2012, 2013 in some cases, but there's a lot of clustering within the last 4 years, basically during President Nelson's presidency. Okay, when he says that we've reached a hinge point, I do not think that he's kidding. I don't, because charting out all these terms, I'm seeing a hinge point. There's a definite difference now than there was in the 2010s for the most part, the 2000s, and the 90s, and the 80s. The only other comparable time is the 70s, and then sometimes the 60s. And then before that, it's just kind of before the 60s to 1942, it's just kind of a mixed bag. Sometimes there's a lot, sometimes there's a lot, but it's more sporadic. Okay, so that's all that I have for this one. Again, this was comes again, hasten, and hastening. Hastening is interesting because that's like a current happening, a current word, and it shows up a lot in the last few years. All right, if you guys haven't already, please make sure to subscribe, like this video if you liked it. Make sure to leave your thoughts and your interpretations. What do you think about this? Do you agree? Do you see something else? Put that in the comments below. Also, make sure to share this with anyone that might find this interesting. And I'll talk to you guys later.